everyone. On behalf of Mike Cooner, Billy Smith, and myself, Susie Ronstadt, we'd like to welcome you to this episode of I Remember Radio. Our special guest today is Bobby Kimmel, who began his musical career with Linda Ronstadt and the Stone Poneys back in the 1960s. Bobby and I both live in Tucson today. Hi, Bobby. Welcome.
Hi.
Would you like to begin by telling us a little bit about how you began your music career?
Sure. First of all, I grew up in the house that I live in now that my father bought here in Tucson in 1948. And somebody in my family has lived here ever since. I started my music career probably because of my father, who was a classical bass player, although in those days he played classical music. He was the principal bass player in the local symphony after we moved here to Tucson. And he also played dance band jobs on the weekend. And so he took me to both symphony rehearsals and dance band jobs when I was 10, 11, 12 years old. And I would sit for hours and listen to the dance bands. I would usually fall asleep during symphony rehearsal before they were over. But the dance band jobs I listened to, and that was my beginning. And I played a couple of instruments. I played the accordion and the clarinet growing up, and I never practiced, and I hated playing them. And then the folk music revolution hit in the early 60s, and the guitar became a popular instrument. And when I got my first guitar, from that time forward, that's all I wanted to do. In the early days, I would go with Linda Ronstadt to a local club and we would play. And then I would go to the campus of the University of Arizona where they have a fountain. And I would practice like until 2 in the morning because the sound of the fountain covered up the noise of my guitar, so nobody ever questioned me. And I practiced and practiced, and that's really all I wanted to do.
And so did you start with a band with Linda then in Tucson when she was still in high school or something? Or?
Yeah, I played bass for a band that had Linda and her older brother, who became the chief of police. It was really a good band. The three of them were as good as any three singers I ever heard. And one night, another policeman walked into this club we were playing. It was a beer bar, and there was Peter. And the next day, he got a call from the police chief, and who brought him in and said, "We don't really think it's good for one of our officers to be playing in a beer bar, so you need to quit the band." And that was it. But Linda and I started out in a small folk music community, and like I said, we used to play together. I'd play guitar and she'd sing. We didn't do any duets. And then what happened was eventually I just ran out of time here in Tucson. My mother said, you have to do something. You have to go to work and get a job, or you have to go to college. And I didn't want to do either one of those things. So I left with my best friend, and we went to LA and finally settled 2 houses off the beach in Santa Monica. Back in the day when that was not an expensive neighborhood, we paid $75 a month to rent a house. And that's where the Stone Poneys was born. I looked around when I first got to LA. I just went around and I looked at the scene and saw what was happening and hung out at the Troubadour like everybody else, and quickly learned that Linda was probably the best singer of all of the women singers I heard who got record deals. Linda was head and shoulders better than all of them. I was only in LA for 6 months. before I started calling Linda, writing to her, and saying, if you want to do music for a living, if you want a record deal, you should come. We'll put a band together. I have a great guitar player, Kenny Edwards, whom I met sitting in the back of a coffee house one day, playing better than anybody I had ever heard. And I asked him if he wanted to play with me, and he said, well, I don't know. I've never been on stage before. And I said I had a really good guitar player, and if she wanted to come, we'd put a band together and see what happened. And she agreed.
And she was pretty young, wasn't she? Like 17 or something?
I think she was either 18 or 19, probably 18 when she came. I think she may have been enrolled in the University of Arizona 1 or 2 semesters, I don't know. But she was in her late teens when she came to LA, and she came with her parents. They needed to check out our house and the scene and make sure we weren't all smoking dope, which of course we were, but not when her parents came.
Did you play at the Troubadour, or did you start playing around town?
Both.
Both.
Mostly we just rehearsed. And when we thought we were good enough, finally, we went and we applied to play on Monday night at the Troubadour. And really, we could have played one time and it would have been enough, because several recording people gave us cards when we came off stage and said, gee, we really liked what you did. You know, if you're interested, give me a call and we'll talk. But it was the second or third time that we played the Troubadour that we finally found our manager. And he managed the Mothers of Invention at that time and a couple of other acts. But Frank Zappa was really huge at the time. And he managed them, and we thought that was a good start. And he in turn took us to Nick Vinay, who became our producer at Capitol Records. And then the rest is really history. And I should say right now that that was the best of the Stone Poneys, was before we got a record deal. After that, it just went downhill. The first thing that happened was Nick Vinay immediately said, well, you should come in and we'll get a couple more guitar players and a drummer, and it just changed everything. All of the songs that we were playing as a trio now had more instrumentation and a drummer. The tempos were faster. Like I said, it was all downhill from there. When they recorded us at Capitol, in the end, what they did was they turned Linda's voice up, because that's what everybody was interested in, was Linda. They turned her harmony parts up to where they were louder than the melody that one of the others of us was singing.
Was it just the three of you that went on the road? Did you go on the road for a while?
We went on the road twice. Kenny Edwards quit the band after the first national tour. I think he really wanted to play rock and roll. And so he quit and started playing electric music. We were an acoustic trio, and that's how we went on the road. And we did a national tour, came home, Kenny quit the band, and we needed to go out one more time. And we went out with a hired bass player and a drummer, Linda singing lead. I sang harmony on some songs, but it was already over when Kenny quit.
How did you come up with the name, the Stone Poneys?
As I remember, we were under pressure from the record company to choose a name, and we didn't have one. So we had this friend who was a musicologist, and he had probably thousands of recordings. And we went over to his house one day, and they were all on cards, on index cards. And we started flipping through them, and we found an old blues song called the Stone Pony Blues. And we went, that's a good name, and that's how we chose it.
And then, we're all from the San Bernardino area, and we used to listen to the Stone Poneys on KMN and KFXM. Do you remember that we had a newspaper that you came out and played out in the Inland Empire? And I know with all those gigs on the road, you might not remember, but we have a little advertisement from the San Bernardino Sun about your gig there.
No, I don't remember that at all. I remember the Inland Empire going to someplace that was a ways away, and that must have been the San Bernardino gig.
Yeah, because it's about 60 miles away.
Yeah, it was about an hour's drive, and I remember going there, and I don't remember the gig or what we did.
Well, we all listened to your song on the radio. We all listened to that. So
I remember the day that they were playing the top 10 on KTKT, which was the local rock station that I listened to back in the 60s. And KTKT was playing the top 10 records. And I remember listening that day, and they had played number 10, number 9, number 8, and it went on, and they didn't play the Stone Poneys. Then they got to number 2, and they said, we'll be right back with the number 1 record. And I thought, we're either number 11 and we've dropped down the charts, or we're number 1. We were number 1.
Oh, cool.
Our record was number 1 everywhere in the country. Sooner or later, the situation was all the local FM stations had their own music director and played whatever they wanted to play. Consequently, our hit became a hit gradually moving across the country, but it wasn't a hit all at one time, every place. So it never made number 1 nationally, but it got to number 1 in pretty much every city I ever went to.
And did you start, when you were touring across the country, did you start opening for bigger bands and things like that?
Yeah. We played for a band that, I don't even remember what they were called at the time, but they had a really famous English guitar player. And it was just a show with 4 or 5 bands that nobody had ever heard of. And then years later, he became a phenomenon.
And did you opened for the Doors one time?
That's a good story, actually. Here's a story that I've never told, certainly never on something that everybody was going to see. But I remember the time when Jim Morrison came over, because he lived a couple of blocks away from us on the beach down in Santa Monica. And we knew who he was, and he came over one day, and we said hello, and he came up on the porch, and we were talking, and he said, our band got a really big break. We're going to play the Whiskey A Go-Go in Hollywood, and we're going to change our name. And I said, what's your new name going to be? And he said, The Doors. And I go, that's the dumbest name I ever heard. Because everybody in those days had 3-word names: the Jefferson Airplane, the Strawberry Alarm Clock, the Stone Poneys. We just thought, because he didn't tell us that it was a reference to The Doors of Perception, the book by Aldous Huxley. And the next time I saw Jim Morrison, we did open for him, and he showed up wearing dark glasses and a suit, sat in the back of the airplane, didn't say a word to anybody, and then went on the stage and did what he did. The Doors was a very strange coming together of musicians, because there was the lead singer, Jim Morrison, and then there were the other 3. And there was a really huge difference I mean, the other guys, like I said, those guys lived 2 blocks away from us when we lived on the beach in Santa Monica. They were just regular guys and stayed regular guys, you know? I mean, it became all about Jim Morrison.
Wasn't there a time when you couldn't get to the gig because of the weather and you had to charter a small plane?
Oh, God. That's a really good story. Humiliating, but good. We were somewhere in the Midwest, and we had to get to somewhere in New York. And it was a snowstorm, and all the planes were grounded, 100%. So our manager started looking for charter flights, and he couldn't find a charter flight. And finally, after hours of work, he located a pilot who had access to a plane. He was a pilot for a hockey club. And we had access to that airplane. And so this guy was hired to fly us to wherever it was. It wasn't New York City, but it was somewhere in New York for this gig with the Doors. And we got there about 40 minutes late. I remember tuning my guitar in the car on the way, changing my clothes in the car, getting dressed, because we knew that we were going to be a half an hour at least late. And we were 40 minutes late. And when we got there, we heard the announcer bringing us on stage going, and now here they are singing their hit record, Different Drum from California, the Stone Poneys, and this huge roar went up from the crowd. We want the Doors. We want the Doors. We want the Doors. And they just continued on. We sang our hit song, and they just chanted all the way through it. We sang one song and left the stage.
Wow. Can you imagine booing Linda Ronstadt off the stage? I mean.
Well, here's an interesting story that I don't think anybody knows. At the end of the second tour, our manager came into my hotel room in New York and said, I want you to know that when this tour ends, the band is over. And I said, I'm the leader of this band. How is it that I don't know that? And he said, well, that's just the way it's going to be. And it was.
And then, so they just wanted Linda?
Yeah. And it was from that time forward, once she went out on her own, it was, I think, 7 years of touring before she had another big hit record. And what was interesting to me was that when she finally, after years of recording an album with one producer and then a different producer and then a different producer, she made 3 or 4 records and none of them sold big. And she got Peter Asher as her manager, and she got a new band, and the new band had Kenny Edwards in it. I'm playing bass, and Andrew Gold playing guitar. And Andrew Gold and Kenny Edwards, from the time he left the Stone Poneys, had been super buddies. They lived together for part of the time. They were really good friends. And they used to get up in the morning, put on a record, and then make coffee. I mean, it was all about learning to play rock and roll. And that was all they did for 6 or 7 years. And by the time she got him, he was a skilled bass player, had always been a good singer. And he sang on all of her early hit records, all of them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what did you do then? Did you continue on in LA with another band, or did you start
No.
Caves? Or
The Stone Poneys had broken up. I didn't have anywhere to go and nothing to do. And I was living in Big Sur, working at Esalen Institute in Big Sur as the vegetable gardener and night watchman. And the owner of McCabe's, which is a guitar store in Santa Monica, came by and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I don't know." I said, "A couple of guys and I are looking for a location in LA where we can open a nightclub. I really want to run a nightclub." I had decided when I came off the road that I really didn't want to tour anymore. I hated touring, but I really loved music. And so I thought I wanted to run a club. And he said, "Well, you know, we've always wanted to do concerts at McCabe's. You should think about that." And it was a done deal. I mean, McCabe's had already been there for years, was an established business. We wouldn't have to find a building. They already had one. We'd have to configure it for having live performance. And that was it. I mean, that's what we did.
And it's still going on, right? It's still going.
It is still, yeah, it's over 50 years later. And what happened was that after a year or two, McCabe's moved next door. And when we did that, we built the back room. It took a while. It took months. And we built, we built everything. We built shelves and storage space, but we also built a stage and a sound room and installed our own sound system. And that sound system was the same one that's there now. So it's in the back room of the same building. And that's where we did shows. And that was a great experience because I got to hear so many great musicians.
And they've got guitars all over the walls in the and they just vibrate with the music. It's just a magical sound place. It really is.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had Doc Watson there one time, and for people listening who don't know, Doc Watson was a really famous guitar player at the time, folk music legend, really, and he was blind from birth. He traveled with his son. And I remember when the first time he went on stage and played at McCabe's, he said, "Son, what is all that ringing I hear?" And he said, "Well, the walls here are covered with guitars, Doc." And Doc went, "Oh, that's it." And so we learned that we needed to thread a card through the strings of every guitar hanging on the wall so it wouldn't do that.
Oh.
That's what we used to do from then on, in his honor.
And you went on tour with him, didn't you?
I did. Largely from that experience. Years later, he called me up and said, "You know, our regular bass player doesn't want to come west on this tour. Do you want to play the West Coast with us?" And it was like from San Francisco all the way down to LA. It was probably 7 or 8 gigs. That was really, really a wonderful experience for me. I got to play double bass.
And did you say he always stayed in the same room so he knew where everything was?
Yeah, what he discovered after a life on the road was that Holiday Inns only had 3 floor plans everywhere. They were all the same. So he could go to a Holiday Inn and the son would open the door and go, "It's B, Doc." It's the B floor plan. And Doc could just walk in the room. He knew everything. So it was really easy for them, life on the road.
How did you decide to do different drum? Was that a song that you wrote, or who wrote the song?
It was written by Michael Nesmith, one of the Monkees. And we learned it from a bluegrass band from the East Coast. John Harold was in that band, the great guitar player. I remember we were out, the three of us were out recording, or we were out performing during the morning that the orchestra was in the studio and they recorded the chart to different drum. We had decided we liked the song, and then the studio hired Jimmy Bond, who was a great bass player, great jazz bass player, Juilliard graduate, became my double bass coach for many years. They hired him to arrange the song, and we came in and they already had played the arrangement. We just had to do the vocals. I didn't actually sing on that song. It's a solo by Linda. And the first time I heard it, I remember thinking to myself, oh, I think that could be a hit. Linda actually didn't like the song. She didn't like the arrangement. She didn't like the song. She didn't, I mean, we were again, I told you the best part of the Stone Poneys was between getting together and getting a record deal. Once we got a record deal, now the record company was on our backs because the record was supposed to come out and we needed 3 songs. So they put the orchestra in the studio with 10 string players and a harp player. And we had to get 3 songs done, and that was one of them. And as I said, Linda didn't like it. I thought it was going to be a hit. And it became a disc jockey somewhere started playing it. I think it was in suburban San Francisco. It wasn't San Francisco proper, but it was Oakland or someplace like that. He started playing it and it became a hit for him. And then other areas started to play it, and eventually it went nationwide.
Did you run into the Wrecking Crew yet, or were they not together yet?
I think that some of those guys may have played some of those recording sessions. We weren't there for that session, but they were around.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just a question of who got them first in those days. They were busy all the time. The other thing I wanted to say was that at the end of her career, I thought Linda Ronstadt was maybe as talented as anybody I had ever met in music. I thought she wasn't when she sang with us. She was starting to come into her own. But by the time 4 or 5 years had gone by and she was on the road constantly, playing with Jackson Browne and whoever, she became a fabulous, fabulous singer. And then by the end of her career, she had done Pirates of Penzance on Broadway. She had recorded with the Nelson Riddle Orchestra and made 2 recordings with them and 2 mariachi records that nobody wanted her to make. They all said, you shouldn't do these records. If you sing in Spanish, you're going to lose your English-speaking audience. And instead, they became the #1 and 2 selling foreign language records ever recorded in this country. So,
and I think they still are. I just heard that the other day. They still are.
Might be.
Yeah.
So I thought Linda just had a spectacular career. I mean, I recognize now that what we did together was just the first part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Really the first part of it. And then what she went on to do on her own So I've never really felt bad about her going out on her own. It just seemed inevitable. We're close now. I talk to her all the time. Every month or so, I call her, she calls me.
How long did you stay in the LA area? When did you go back to, I guess it really is home?
Oh, yeah. Well, as I said, I live in the house I grew up in. So it couldn't be more home for me. I spent way too long in LA. I was in LA for 40 years. The first 20 years were really fun. It was the Stone Poneys time and McCabe's. But after that, I just had to find a job. And I did. I worked in real estate in LA for, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, and then moved to Tucson and worked here for a while. But I did want to say, before we finish, that I moved to Tucson with my friend Joe Wilkinson, who was living in LA at the time. And I said to her, we talked to each other on the phone, and she said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to move home. I'm going to move back to Tucson." And she said, "Well, I'll come." And I went, "What?" And she said, "Well, I hate LA. It's a good time for me to leave. I'll leave." And she did. And we formed a band here in Tucson called Four Corners. It was Joe Wilkinson and I, Stephen George, and Lavinia White, who Stephen was a brilliant, brilliant guitar player. And the four of us played together for 8 or 9 years. And now Stephen and his wife are both gone. They're both passed away. Joe is still in LA. But that was the first thing I did here. And then I got together with Kathy Harris one time. And I did it because she had been married for many years to this great guy who was her musical partner, life partner. He was her whole life, and he passed away due to an unfortunate accident, and I felt really bad for her. And I asked her one time, I called her up and I said, "Hey, do you want to get together?" I mean, she played the auto harp and I played the guitar, and I thought maybe we could just do something together so she wouldn't be so left out of everything. And we tried it a few times and it just didn't work. But before I quit, I said, I have another idea. I just wrote this new song. And I could record it for you, and I could record your harmony part along with my part, and we could sing it together and see how that works. And we did, and it was a hard part. It was not simple, and I didn't know if she could do it. And I talked to her maybe a week later, and I said, "You want to get together?" And she said, "Oh yeah, I've got it." And I was surprised. And we got together, and she had the part down perfectly. And during that rehearsal, I said, "Wow," I said, "it would be good if we had a couple more voices to sing backup parts during this middle section." And she goes, "Well, we could talk to Bobby and Susie Ronstadt. They sing really well together, and we've sung together a couple times." And the four of us got together in my living room, which is a great sounding room. And that was it.
The way I Hear Voices got started for us was Kathy gave us a demo of this song to learn to come to the first rehearsal to sing with Bobby and Kathy. And we had learned some pretty neat parts, and we thought we would surprise them. And we did. We got there and we put on these parts, and they were both kind of pleased. So then the four of us became I Hear Voices.
At that first rehearsal, we decided that we wanted to sing together. And we said, well, let's do this. let's get together and be a band and rehearse and work out 4-part vocals. And I said, how often do you want to get together? And somebody said, well, let's get together once a week. And somebody else said, no, let's get together twice a week. I mean, I couldn't believe that everybody in the band wanted to rehearse twice a week. But we did, and we rehearsed twice a week for 5.5 years.
4 CDs.
We made 4 CDs, and it was heaven. It was the most fun I ever had playing music, and I'm working now to put that band back together, largely because I'm so frustrated from COVID-19 and from not seeing my friends that I'm going to try to put together. It's interesting, while we were talking, my screen lit up and there was a message from Kathy Harris. So she's responding to my request to see if we want to learn any new songs.
Bobby, I just want to thank you so much for sharing all your stories with us today, and I'm really looking forward to our renewed band, and I know that Mike and Billy enjoyed meeting you too, so thank you.
Oh, it was a pleasure, Susie. I'm really grateful that we had this opportunity, and it was great to talk about Linda's career. I still think that she was one of the great artists of our time, and so thank you all very much.